A young black lawyer, fresh off a career-defining victory in court, was finally heading home to celebrate with his family. But when he stepped into the high-end cafe at the airport, everything changed. A cashier eyed him suspiciously. Then a security officer arrived, demanding proof of his purchase. Despite his calm explanation and the receipt in his hand, they humiliated him in front of everyone, accusing him of trying to take advantage of the system. Just 6 minutes later, a video of the incident surfaced. And what happened next set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. What unfolded wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about courage in the face of prejudice and the power of standing up for what's right. Stay with me, because this is a story that will leave you speechless. Before we dive into the full story, comment below with where you're watching from and share your thoughts. How would you react in a situation like this? And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more eye-opening stories. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary day. The morning light filtered through the dusty blinds of the small corner cafe, casting long, golden streaks across the scratched tabletops. Ernest Simmons, a man in his late 50s with broad shoulders and deep-set, thoughtful eyes, sat alone at a table near the window. His coffee, black and untouched, sent thin spirals of steam into the air, merging with the low hum of conversations around him. He was waiting. Ernest had been to this cafe dozens of times over the years. It was one of the few places in his neighborhood that hadn't changed much. Despite the slow creep of gentrification that had turned the area into a patchwork of hip boutiques and overpriced lofts, the regulars still came here. The older men with their newspapers, the women with their weathered faces and warm, tired smiles. But today, something felt off. A young man walked in, his shoes scuffing against the worn tiles. He was tall, wiry, and jittery, with the kind of restless energy Ernest recognized from years of watching people hustle for something. Anything that might give them a break. The man glanced around the cafe, his eyes darting past Ernest. Before approaching the counter, Ernest watched him quietly, noting the way the barista tensed when the man spoke. The barista was new. She was young, fresh out of college, with a nervous smile that barely masked her unease. She handed the young man his coffee with a speed that bordered on panic, her hand brushing his as she avoided his eyes. The young man muttered his thanks and turned, clutching his cup like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Ernest felt the tension ripple through the room. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, in the way the conversations had softened, in the way the other patrons seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. He knew the feeling well. It was the unspoken unease that often followed someone who didn't quite fit the picture of what people expected to see. The young man wore his difference like a second skin, and the room wore its judgment like a heavy coat. The man sat down 2 tables away from Ernest, his back to the wall, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller. Ernest saw the way his hands shook as he reached for a sugar packet, the way he glanced up every so often, his eyes scanning the room like he was waiting for something to go wrong. It didn't take long. "Excuse me," a voice said sharply. It was the cafe manager, a middle-aged woman with a clipboard in hand. She stood a few feet away from the young man's table, her expression tight. "We have a policy about loitering." The young man looked up, startled. "I'm not loitering," he said quietly. "I bought a coffee." The manager's eyes flicked to the cup in his hand, then back to his face. "You've been sitting here a while. If you're not planning to order anything else, I'll have to ask you to leave." The room grew quieter. Ernest could feel the collective discomfort settling over the patrons like a fog. No one spoke, but he could see the unease in their faces, the way they avoided looking directly at the manager or the young man. "I just got here," the man said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I haven't even finished my coffee." The manager hesitated, as though she hadn't expected him to push back. She glanced around the room, her gaze landing briefly on Ernest before she looked back at the young man. "We've had issues with people hanging around," she said, her voice trailing off awkwardly. "It's nothing personal." Ernest felt the weight of her words, the way they hung in the air like smoke. He saw the flicker of hurt in the young man's eyes, quickly replaced by a guarded defiance. "It feels personal," the young man said. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and placed the coffee cup back on the table. "I'm leaving," he added, his voice low but firm. "But not because of your policy. Because I don't need to be somewhere I'm not welcome. As the young man walked toward the door, Ernest caught his eye for a brief moment. There was something there, a quiet, unspoken understanding. Ernest nodded, a subtle gesture that the young man returned before stepping out into the street. The cafe manager sighed, smoothing her apron as she turned back toward the counter. The tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a hesitant return to normalcy. Conversations resumed, though quieter than before. Ernest sat back in his chair, his coffee still untouched. He looked out the window, watching as the young man disappeared down the block. The moment had passed, but its weight lingered in the room. Ernest knew this was just the beginning, a crack in the surface of something much deeper, much harder to ignore. And he knew, as he sat there in the fading morning light, that the day would bring more moments like this. Moments that tested not just patience, but the very fabric of who people thought they were. The city pulsed with life as Ernest Simmons stepped out of the cafe, the weight of the morning still lingering in his chest. The streets were alive with the usual cacophony, car horns blaring, vendors shouting, and the rhythmic clatter of heels against pavement. Yet, beneath the surface of this vibrant chaos, Ernest sensed an unease that mirrored what he had just witnessed inside. He adjusted his coat against the crisp air and began walking toward the community center where he volunteered a few afternoons each week. It wasn't far, but the walk always gave him time to think, to process the moments that often carried more weight than they seemed to at first glance. As he turned onto a quieter street, a group of teenagers laughed loudly near the corner. They wore school uniforms, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. One boy, his laughter the loudest, gestured animatedly while the others listened. Ernest smiled faintly. Their energy reminded him of his own youth. Long ago but never far from his memory. The laughter faltered as another boy appeared at the edge of the group, clutching a basketball under one arm. His uniform was the same, but his demeanor was different, more reserved, less sure of himself. Ernest watched as the boy hesitated, his steps slowing as he neared the group. The laughter quieted, replaced by a murmur of hushed voices and sideways glances. The boy shifted the basketball nervously between his hands, then stopped a few feet away, clearly waiting to be acknowledged. One of the teens, a tall boy with sharp features, turned to him. "What do you want, Marcus?" he asked, his tone flat but cutting. The others exchanged glances, a silent exchange Ernest had seen countless times before. Marcus looked down at the basketball, then back up. "I thought we could shoot hoops after school," he said, his voice tentative. The tall boy scoffed. "I don't think so, man, maybe next time." His words hung in the air, thick with an unspoken edge that everyone understood but no one named. Marcus nodded once, his face carefully blank, and stepped back. "Yeah, sure, next time." He turned and walked away, the basketball tucked tightly under his arm. The group resumed their laughter, but it sounded forced now, their movements a little more awkward. Ernest felt a pang in his chest as he watched Marcus disappear down the street. The scene was familiar, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was subtle, ordinary, the kind of exclusion that left no visible scars but built walls that were just as real. At the community center, Ernest was greeted by familiar faces. Miss Clara, the receptionist, waved at him from behind her desk, her silver curls framing a face lined with years of warmth and wisdom. "Morning, Ernest," she said. "You're looking sharp today." "Thank you, Clara," Ernest replied with a small smile. "How's everything here?" "Busy as always," she said with a knowing chuckle. "You've got a group of kids waiting for you in the library. They've been asking when you'd get here." Ernest nodded and made his way to the small library at the back of the building. The room was a sanctuary of sorts, with shelves packed tight with books of all genres and tables where young minds came to read, learn, and dream. Today, a handful of middle schoolers were scattered across the room, their backpacks slung over chairs, their heads bent over notebooks. "Mr. Simmons," a girl called out, her face lighting up when she saw him. She waved him over eagerly. "Can you help me with this essay? I don't know where to start." Ernest chuckled. "Let me see what you've got." Rachel, as he moved through the room, helping one child after another. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus walking away from the group of boys. It was the same unease he'd felt in the cafe, a quiet tension that seemed to be woven into the fabric of everyday life. Later, as Ernest left the center, He found himself on a bench outside, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the pavement. He wasn't alone for long. Miss Clara stepped out, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. "You've been quiet today," she said, sitting down beside him. Ernest nodded. "It's been one of those days." Clara raised an eyebrow. "One of those days? Or one of those days?" He smiled faintly. Clara had a way of cutting to the heart of things. "I saw something at the cafe this morning," he said finally. "And then again on my way here. It's not the kind of thing people notice. But it stays with you. The looks, the tones, the little ways people tell you who they think you are, who they think you aren't." Clara nodded slowly. "You don't have to tell me, Ernest. I've been seeing it my whole life." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experiences settling between them like an old, familiar companion. "It's like a whisper," Ernest said quietly. "It's not loud, but it's always there. You can't escape it, no matter how much you try to ignore it. And the worst part is, most people don't even hear it. They don't know it's there." Clara sighed. "That's because it's not meant for them. It's meant for us." Ernest turned to her, his eyes filled with the kind of understanding that comes only from years of living through the same struggles. "Do you think it ever stops?" he asked, his voice soft. Clara gave him a small, sad smile. "I think it changes, Ernest. But stopping? No, it doesn't stop." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ernest felt a heaviness settle over him. The day had been filled with moments that felt small but carried the weight of something far larger. He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain: the whispers were growing louder. And ignoring them was no longer an option. The following week, Ernest Simmons found himself on familiar streets that now seemed less inviting. The autumn air was sharp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the distant hum of life bustling onward. But Ernest walked with a sense of purpose, his steps steady despite the growing unease in his chest. He was heading to the courthouse, a place he rarely visited unless necessary. He had been summoned for jury duty, a civic responsibility that stirred conflicting emotions within him. On one hand, he believed deeply in justice, in fairness, in the idea that everyone deserves their day in court. On the other hand, he had lived long enough to see how those ideals often fell apart when they collided with the reality of prejudice. The courthouse lobby buzzed with activity, its marble floors amplifying every footstep and murmured conversation. Ernest joined the line for security, his movements deliberate, his face calm but wary. Ahead of him, a young woman juggled her bag and a phone call, her voice sharp with frustration as she tried to explain her delay to someone on the other end. When it was Ernest's turn, he placed his belongings in the tray and stepped through the metal detector. The guard, a broad-shouldered man with a clipped voice, waved him through but stopped him as he reached for his items. "Hold on a second," the guard said, his tone more suspicious than necessary. "What's this?" Ernest turned to see the guard holding up his leather-bound notebook, the one he carried everywhere. "It's a notebook," Ernest replied evenly. The guard flipped through it, his movements brisk and invasive. "Why do you need this in here?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Ernest's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I write. It's where I keep my thoughts." The guard looked at him for a moment, then handed the notebook back with a dismissive grunt. "Fine, move along." As Ernest gathered his belongings, he felt the familiar sting of being scrutinized for no reason. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But each encounter left a mark, a subtle reminder that his presence was always being questioned. In the jury assembly room, Ernest found a seat near the back. The room was packed, the air heavy with a mix of impatience and boredom. People scrolled through their phones, flipped through magazines, or stared at the clock as if willing time to move faster. Ernest pulled out his notebook and began to write, the act grounding him amidst the hum of voices and rustling papers. His pen moved across the page, capturing fragments of thoughts. Justice isn't blind. It just pretends to be. He was deep in thought when the room quieted, the sudden silence drawing his attention. A court officer had entered, a clipboard in hand. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice brisk but polite. "We're going to start calling names for jury selection. Please listen carefully and respond when you hear your name." The names came one after another, the officer's voice cutting through the stillness. Ernest listened, his mind wandering to what kind of case might await him. When his name was finally called, he stood and followed the officer along with a small group of others. The courtroom was smaller than Ernest expected. Its walls lined with dark wood that seemed to absorb the light. The judge sat at the front, her expression neutral but commanding. The attorneys, one defense, one prosecution, sat at their respective tables, their faces composed but watchful. As the selection process began, Ernest noticed the subtle ways the attorneys interacted with the prospective jurors. They asked polite questions, their tones measured, but there was an undercurrent of calculation in every word. They weren't just looking for impartiality. They were looking for advantage. When it was Ernest's turn, he stood and answered their questions carefully. His voice calm but firm. He could feel their eyes on him, assessing, measuring. The defense attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in a tailored suit, seemed particularly interested in him. "Mr. Simmons," she said, leaning slightly forward, "do you believe the justice system treats everyone equally?" Ernest paused, considering his words. "I believe it was designed to," he said finally, "but the reality doesn't always match the design." There was a murmur in the courtroom, a subtle shift in the air. The prosecutor, a young man with an easy smile, nodded slightly as if to acknowledge Ernest's honesty. "And why do you think that is?" the defense attorney pressed. Ernest met her gaze, his expression unflinching. "Because people bring their biases into the system. Sometimes it's unconscious, sometimes it's not, but it's always there." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. The defense attorney hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons. That will be all." When the jury was finalized, Ernest found himself among those selected. The case was straightforward on the surface. A theft at a local department store. But as the trial began, it became clear that the real story lay beneath the surface. The defendant, a young black man named Darius, sat at the defense table, his face calm but tense. The prosecution painted him as reckless, impulsive, and dishonest, their words laced with subtle implications that didn't need to be said outright. The defense worked to humanize him, to show that he was more than the sum of the accusations against him. As the trial unfolded, Ernest watched the dynamics of the courtroom with a sharp eye. He saw the way the jurors shifted in their seats when certain evidence was presented. The way they glanced at Darius when they thought no one was looking. He saw the way the prosecutor emphasized certain words, planting seeds of doubt that didn't rely on facts but on perceptions. By the end of the day, Ernest felt the weight of the trial pressing down on him. It wasn't just about Darius. It was about the system that had placed him here, the biases that would shape his fate. That evening, Ernest sat at his kitchen table, his notebook open before him. He wrote furiously, the words spilling out faster than he could contain them. "The courtroom is a stage. And we are the audience. But the play is rigged. The script written long before the actors take their places." As he wrote, he thought about Darius, about the guard at the courthouse, about Marcus and the boys on the corner. The whispers were growing louder, the tension building, and Ernest knew that the uneven ground they all walked on was growing more treacherous with every step. The second day of the trial began under a sky heavy with rain. The courthouse, a hulking stone building, loomed in the gray morning light as Ernest Simmons stepped through its doors. He carried with him the same notebook, though now its pages held restless scribbles from the previous evening. The sense of foreboding that had settled over him during jury selection had not dissipated, if anything. It had deepened. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was taut, charged by the unspoken undercurrents that accompanied a case like this. The defendant, Darius, sat at the defense table with his attorney, his shoulders slightly hunched as though bracing for the weight of the day ahead. Across the room, the prosecutor shuffled papers, exuding an air of confidence that Ernest found unsettling. The morning session began with the testimony of the store manager who had called the police on Darius. A white man in his late 50s. He wore a crisp suit and spoke with an air of authority. He described the events of the alleged theft in precise detail, his voice steady but laced with irritation. "I saw him loitering near the electronics section," the manager said, his gaze sweeping over the jurors. "He wasn't shopping, just standing there, looking suspicious." The prosecutor nodded, his expression one of approval. "And what happened next?" "I watched him for a while," the manager continued. "He kept glancing around, like he was checking to see if anyone was watching. Then he picked up a pair of headphones and slipped them into his jacket pocket." Ernest shifted in his seat, his pen hovering over his notebook. Something about the manager's tone, the certainty, the conviction, made him uneasy. It wasn't just what the man was saying, it was how he was saying it. As though he had decided Darius's guilt long before the headphones ever went missing. The defense attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Collins, approached the witness stand with quiet determination. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice calm but firm, "did you ever confront my client directly? Ask him if he intended to pay for the headphones?" The manager frowned. "No, that's not my job. I called security." "And did you see him leave the store with the headphones?" There was a pause, brief but telling. "No," the manager admitted. "He was stopped before he could leave." Ms. Collins nodded, her expression thoughtful. "So, just to clarify, you assumed he was stealing because of where he was standing and how he looked?" The manager bristled. "I've been doing this job for 30 years. I know when someone's about to steal." "Do you?" Ms. Collins asked, her tone unyielding. "Or do you think you know based on your assumptions about certain people?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Ernest glanced at his fellow jurors and noted their reactions. Some shifted in their seats. Others avoided eye contact. The tension was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken biases at play. During the lunch recess, Ernest found himself in the courthouse cafeteria. His tray balanced precariously as he searched for a quiet corner. He spotted an empty table near the window and made his way over, only to find himself joined moments later by one of the other jurors. A woman named Mrs. Thornton. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. "Not at all," Ernest replied, gesturing to the seat across from him. For a while, they ate in silence, the clatter of utensils and muted conversations filling the space between them. Then, without looking up from her salad, Mrs. Thornton spoke. "This case, it's tricky, isn't it?" Ernest glanced at her, noting the hesitation in her voice. "Tricky how?" "Well," she said, setting her fork down, there's a lot to consider. I mean, the evidence seems clear, but there's something about the way the prosecutor keeps pushing that feels off." Ernest nodded slowly. "It's not just the evidence," he said, "it's the assumptions that come with it." Mrs. Thornton looked at him sharply, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Ernest leaned forward, his voice low. "People like Darius, young black men, they're seen a certain way before they even open their mouths. It's not about what he did or didn't do. It's about what people expect of him." Mrs. Thornton hesitated, her brow furrowing. "That's a heavy thing to say." "It's a heavy thing to live," Ernest replied. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session brought more witnesses, each adding another layer to the case. But for Ernest, the details became less important than the patterns. He noticed how the prosecutor's questions subtly reinforced stereotypes, how the witnesses spoke with a certainty that belied the gaps in their stories. He noticed how Darius sat quietly, his face composed but his eyes heavy with the knowledge that his fate was being decided by people who didn't truly see him. The weight of it all settled on Ernest as the day came to a close. He left the courthouse with his notebook tucked under his arm, his mind buzzing with the complexity of what he had witnessed. The whispers were growing louder now, the unspoken truths pressing against the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. As he walked home in the fading light, Ernest thought about the ground they all stood on. Uneven, shifting, and fragile. He thought about how easy it was for people to trip, to stumble, to fall, and he thought about Darius, a young man trying to navigate a world that seemed determined to see him as something he wasn't. In his heart, Ernest knew this trial wasn't just about theft. It was about the weight of assumptions, about the quiet violence of prejudice, and about the question that lingered in the air like a storm cloud. Who gets the benefit of the doubt? The courtroom was heavier on the third day. The previous sessions had established a framework, but now the details were set to become sharper. Cutting through the fog of bias and assumption, Ernest Simmons sat at his place in the jury box, his notebook open but untouched. As he waited for the proceedings to begin, around him, his fellow jurors whispered to one another, their voices carrying a mix of curiosity and apprehension. When the session opened, the prosecutor introduced a key piece of evidence, grainy security footage from the store. On the screen, Darius moved through the aisles, his motions slow, deliberate. He paused near the electronics section, picked up a pair of headphones, and examined them. Then, he placed them back on the shelf and continued browsing. The footage was silent, stripped of context, and the prosecutor's narration filled the void. "You see here," he said, pointing to the screen. "The defendant appears to be lingering near the electronics section. Notice how he keeps looking around, clearly checking to see if anyone is watching." Ernest squinted at the screen. The footage was poor in quality. The details murky. He couldn't see Darius's face clearly. Couldn't tell if his glances were furtive or merely casual. Yet the prosecutor spoke with a certainty that seemed to will the jurors into agreement. "Now, watch as he picks up the headphones." The prosecutor continued, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Notice how he handles them. How he seems to hesitate. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the behavior of someone simply shopping." Ernest's pen hovered over his notebook. But he didn't write. Something about the prosecutor's tone gnawed at him. A confidence that felt too rehearsed. Too eager to convince. The footage didn't tell a story, it hinted at one. And the story it hinted at depended entirely on the lens through which it was viewed. The defense's cross-examination offered a counter-narrative. Ms. Collins, sharp and unyielding, addressed the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, gesturing to the paused footage on the screen. "What do we actually see here? A young man shopping. He picks up an item, examines it, and puts it back. Is this unusual behavior? Is it criminal?" She turned to the prosecutor. "My esteemed colleague would have you believe that every glance, every pause, is evidence of guilt. But I ask you, how many of you have done the exact same thing while shopping? Picked something up, looked at it, put it back? Should we assume that you, too, had nefarious intentions?" A murmur rippled through the jury box. Ernest noticed Mrs. Thornton shift uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting to the prosecutor as though seeking reassurance. He couldn't help but wonder how many of his fellow jurors were beginning to feel the cracks in the narrative they'd been presented. During a break, Ernest found himself in the courthouse hallway, leaning against a wall with his arms crossed. He was deep in thought when a fellow juror, Mr. Reed, approached him. Reed was a retired teacher, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression thoughtful. "Something on your mind?" Reed asked, his tone friendly but probing. Ernest hesitated, then nodded. "This case, it's not as simple as they're making it out to be." Reed raised an eyebrow. "You think he's innocent?" "I don't know," Ernest admitted, "but I do know that what we've seen so far doesn't prove he's guilty. It's all assumptions, interpretations. They're building a story around him. But it's not rooted in facts." Reed nodded slowly. "I hear you, but you know how people are. They see what they expect to see." Ernest looked at him sharply. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Reed didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced down the hallway, where Darius sat with his attorney, his posture tense but composed. "It's hard to see the truth," Reed said finally, "when the story people want to believe is louder than the facts." The afternoon session brought a new witness, the store's security guard. A burly man with a shaved head and a no-nonsense demeanor. He testified about the moments leading up to Darius's detainment. "I got a call from the manager," the guard said, his voice gruff. "He told me there was a suspicious individual in the electronics section. So I went to check it out." "And what did you observe?" the prosecutor asked. "He was standing there, looking around a lot. He picked up the headphones, put them in his pocket." Ms. Collins rose for a cross-examination. "You're certain you saw him put the headphones in his pocket?" The guard hesitated. "Well, that's what it looked like." "So you didn't actually see the headphones go into his pocket?" No, I didn't." Ms. Collins stepped closer to the witness stand. "And when you approached my client, did you find any stolen merchandise on him?" The guard's jaw tightened. "No. No headphones? No electronics of any kind?" "No." Ms. Collins turned to the jury. Her expression pointed. "So, to recap, the manager assumed. The guard assumed. And now we're here. But where is the evidence?" As the day drew to a close, Ernest walked home under a sky painted in hues of amber and gray. His notebook was heavy in his hand, its pages filled with questions rather than answers. He thought about the security footage, the testimonies, the subtle ways bias had shaped the narrative against Darius. It wasn't just about this case. It was about the countless others that never made it to court. The lives quietly unraveled by assumptions that masqueraded as truth. He thought about what Reed had said. People see what they expect to see. And he wondered, as he stepped into the quiet of his home, what it would take for people to start seeing differently. The city was washed in shadows by the time Ernest Simmons stepped off the bus and made his way toward his modest home. He could hear the hum of life around him, laughter spilling from a nearby stoop, the faint rhythm of a jazz saxophone drifting through an open window. It was familiar, comforting even, but tonight, it all felt distant. His mind was consumed by the weight of the trial and the echoes of its unspoken tensions. The jury deliberations had grown increasingly fraught. Each day brought sharper disagreements, the room feeling less like a forum for justice and more like a battlefield of deeply ingrained beliefs. Ernest had never considered himself naive, but the trial was revealing just how heavy a burden the truth could be when everyone had their own version of it. Earlier that day, the courtroom had buzzed with a particular energy as the defense called its next witness, a store clerk who had been present during the incident. The clerk, a wiry young man with glasses too large for his face, seemed nervous as he took the stand. "Mr. Lewis," began Ms. Collins, the defense attorney, her voice steady but warm. "You were working at the store on the day in question, correct?" "Yes," the clerk replied, fidgeting with his hands. "I was at the register." "And you saw Mr. Darius Williams in the electronics section?" He nodded. "Yeah, I remember seeing him." "What was he doing?" "He was just looking around. You know, like any customer would. Picked up some headphones, put them back." Ms. Collins leaned in slightly, her tone sharpening. "Did you see him take anything? Did you see him put anything in his pockets?" The clerk hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I didn't see him take anything." The prosecutor's cross-examination sought to undermine the clerk's credibility. "Mr. Lewis," he began, his tone clipped, "you were at the register, correct? How far is the register from the electronics section?" Maybe 50 feet? "So, from 50 feet away, are you certain you could see whether the defendant put anything in his pockets?" The clerk faltered, his voice quieter now. "I mean, no, not completely, but I didn't see him do anything suspicious." "Thank you, Mr. Lewis." No further questions. During the deliberations that followed, the jury room felt increasingly suffocating. Ernest could see the lines being drawn, not just around the evidence, but around the jurors themselves. Mrs. Thornton, whose sharp gaze always carried an air of moral certainty, had taken to using words like integrity and law-abiding. Mr. Reed, the retired teacher, spoke less now, his earlier curiosity replaced by a kind of weary resignation. It was the younger jurors, those who seemed eager to assert themselves, who brought the most heat to the room. A man in his 30s named Andrew spoke with an authority that grated on Ernest. "Look," Andrew said, leaning back in his chair, "I'm not saying the guy's guilty, but you have to admit, he looked suspicious. Why was he lingering in the electronics section?" Ernest had had enough. "What does suspicious look like, Andrew?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Andrew blinked, caught off guard. "I mean, you know." Quote, "No," Ernest interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know. Why don't you explain it to me?" The room fell silent. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Mrs. Thornton cleared her throat. "There's no need to get defensive, Mr. Simmons." "I'm not defensive," Ernest replied, his tone sharp, "but I am tired. Tired of us pretending we're just talking about evidence when what we're really talking about is the story we've already decided to believe." The tension in the room lingered even after the deliberation was called to an end for the day. As Ernest walked through the courthouse hallway, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the task before them. It wasn't just about Darius Williams. It was about all the moments like this that came before, and all the moments that would come after. At home, Ernest sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the steam curling into the dim light. He thought about the young man on trial, about how easily a life could be derailed by a single accusation. He thought about the other jurors, each carrying their own histories, their own biases, their own justifications, and then he thought about himself, about the times he had been on the receiving end of assumptions, about the times he had swallowed his pride because it was safer than speaking out, about the moments when silence had felt like the only choice. But now, silence wasn't an option. As the clock struck midnight, Ernest picked up his pen and opened his notebook. He began writing, not just about the trial, but about the world outside of it, about the quiet, everyday ways in which people decided who mattered and who didn't, about the thin line between assumption and truth, and how easily it could be crossed. By the time he set the pen down, the coffee had gone cold. But his resolve burned steady and bright. Tomorrow, he will speak again, and this time, he would make sure they listened. The jury room was suffused with the glow of late afternoon sunlight streaming through the blinds, creating a pattern of light and shadow on the table. The lines felt symbolic to Ernest Simmons, sitting at his usual seat, watching the tension in the room ripple outward like cracks in glass. The weight of deliberation was no longer confined to the trial. It hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Ernest studied his fellow jurors, each lost in their own thoughts. The room had become a battleground of quiet conflicts and simmering frustrations, each person holding fast to their perspective. The evidence was clear to some, murky to others, but what truly complicated matters were the unspoken biases, the invisible forces pulling at the edges of the case. Mrs. Thornton broke the silence, her voice sharp and deliberate. "We're not here to discuss social issues," she said, glancing pointedly at Ernest. "We're here to decide whether Mr. Williams committed a crime. Let's stick to the facts." Ernest folded his hands, meeting her gaze with quiet resolve. "The facts are exactly what I'm talking about," he replied, "but facts don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by how we see the world, by what we choose to notice and what we ignore." Andrew, the younger juror who often took on the role of devil's advocate, leaned forward in his chair. "Are you saying we're biased?" His tone was defensive, a challenge. "I'm saying we're human," Ernest answered, "and being human means we bring our experiences, our assumptions, into this room. If we don't acknowledge that, we're lying to ourselves." The conversation splintered into smaller arguments. Mrs. Thornton insisted on returning to the evidence, her tone growing sharper with each interruption. Andrew doubled down, dismissing Ernest's points as overly philosophical. Meanwhile, a few jurors exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to voice their thoughts. It was Mr. Reed, the retired teacher, who finally broke through the noise. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're not going to get anywhere by talking past each other. Let's take a step back." The room fell quiet, and Ernest nodded his gratitude toward Mr. Reed. "That's exactly what we need to do," he said. "Take a step back and really look at what's happening here. Not just in this case, but in this room." Ernest drew a deep breath, knowing the next words would be difficult but necessary. "When I was a young man," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I was stopped by the police while walking home from a friend's house. They said I looked like someone who'd been causing trouble in the area. I hadn't done anything, but they didn't believe me. They searched me right there on the sidewalk. I still remember the look on their faces, like they'd already decided who I was." He paused, letting the weight of his story sink in. "That's what we're doing here," he continued. "We've already decided who Darius Williams is. We've decided what he looks like, how he acts, what he's capable of, and we're using those decisions to fill in the gaps in the evidence." Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but it was Mrs. Thornton who responded first. "That's not fair," she said, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "I haven't made any assumptions." Ernest's gaze softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "I think you have," he said gently. "We all have, and that's not an accusation. It's a call to reflect. This isn't just about whether Darius Williams took something from that store. It's about how quickly we're willing to believe he did." The room was silent again, but this time the quiet felt different. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of disagreement. It was the stillness of people forced to confront something they hadn't wanted to see. As the hours dragged on, the jurors began to open up, their conversations growing more nuanced. Mrs. Thornton admitted that she'd been frustrated by the trial, feeling as though the focus on systemic issues had distracted from the case at hand. Andrew acknowledged that he had jumped to conclusions, though he stopped short of fully admitting his bias. Even the quieter jurors began to contribute, their voices tentative but thoughtful. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the room felt lighter. They weren't in agreement yet. Not fully, but something had shifted. There was a willingness to listen, to question, to dig deeper. Ernest left the courthouse that evening feeling both exhausted and hopeful. The day had been draining, but it had also been a reminder of the power of persistence, of the importance of speaking up even when the words felt like they were falling on deaf ears. Walking home, he passed by a group of young boys playing basketball on a cracked court. Their laughter filled the air. Carefree and unburdened, Ernest smiled, thinking of how much he wanted a better world for them. A world where they wouldn't have to carry the same weight he had carried for so long. As he approached his front door, the words of his late father echoed in his mind. The truth isn't always easy, son, but it's always worth it. Tomorrow would be another day in the jury room, another battle to fight, but for tonight, Ernest allowed himself a moment of peace. He had taken a step toward the truth, and that, he knew, was worth everything. The jury room had become a crucible, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Ernest Simmons could feel the weight of every decision, every word spoken and unspoken. After days of deliberation, the 12 jurors sat around the table, their faces etched with fatigue and uncertainty. The case of Darius Williams, a young black man accused of theft, had become more than just a question of guilt or innocence. It had become a mirror reflecting their own biases, their own beliefs. Ernest looked around the room, taking in the expressions of his fellow jurors. Mrs. Thornton's lips were pressed into a thin line, her gaze fixed on the table. Andrew tapped his pen against his notebook, his restless energy a stark contrast to the stillness of the others. Mr. Reed sat with his hands folded, his eyes thoughtful but weary. The other jurors avoided eye contact, their body language betraying the discomfort they tried to conceal. It was Ernest who broke the silence. "We've spent hours going over the evidence," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We've analyzed every piece, debated every angle, but there's something we haven't done yet." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Ernest leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "We haven't been honest, with ourselves or with each other. This case isn't just about what Darius Williams did or didn't do. It's about how we've approached it. It's about the assumptions we've brought into this room." Mrs. Thornton shifted in her seat, her discomfort palpable. "I don't see how that's relevant," she said, her voice clipped. "We're here to determine whether he's guilty, not to examine our personal biases." Ernest met her gaze, unflinching. "But our biases affect how we see the evidence. They affect what we believe, what we're willing to question, and what we accept without hesitation. If we don't acknowledge that, we're not doing our job." The room fell silent again, the weight of Ernest's words sinking in. One by one, the jurors began to speak, their voices hesitant at first but growing stronger as they shared their perspectives. Andrew was the first to admit his bias. "I think, maybe I jumped to conclusions," he said, his tone reluctant. "When I saw Darius on that security footage, I assumed the worst. I didn't stop to think about why I assumed that." Mrs. Thornton sighed, her expression softening. "I suppose I've been guilty of that too," she admitted. "I've spent so much time trying to focus on the facts that I didn't consider how my own feelings were influencing me." Mr. Reed nodded in agreement. "We all bring our experiences into this room, whether we realize it or not. The important thing is to recognize it and try to move past it." As the conversation deepened, the jurors began to re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes. They questioned the inconsistencies in the testimony of the store clerk who had accused Darius. Noting his reluctance to answer certain questions, they scrutinized the grainy security footage. Realizing that it didn't conclusively show Darius taking anything, they discussed the lack of physical evidence and the discrepancies in the timeline. But more than that, they began to confront the larger questions at the heart of the case. Why had Darius been targeted in the first place? Why had the police been so quick to arrest him without thorough investigation? Why had his innocence been questioned so readily? By the time the clock struck midnight, the mood in the room had shifted. The tension was still there, but it was accompanied by a sense of clarity, a shared understanding that they were no longer just jurors. They were part of something larger, something that demanded honesty and courage. Ernest took a deep breath and looked around the table. "We've all learned something in this room," he said, "but this isn't just about us. It's about what kind of world we want to live in. It's about whether we're willing to stand up for justice, even when it's uncomfortable." The jurors exchanged glances, and one by one, they nodded. The decision was unanimous. The next morning, the verdict was delivered in a courtroom filled with tension. Darius sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes fixed on the jury box. His mother sat behind him, her face a mask of worry and hope. The clerk read the verdict, "Not guilty." A wave of emotion swept through the room. Darius's mother broke into quiet sobs, her hands covering her face. Darius exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging with relief. Across the room, the store clerk looked stunned, his confidence shattered. Ernest stood outside the courthouse after the trial, watching as Darius and his mother embraced, their tears a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It was a moment of triumph. But Ernest knew it was only one step in a much larger journey. The system that had nearly destroyed Darius's life still loomed large, its flaws exposed but not yet dismantled. A reporter approached Ernest, microphone in hand. "Mr. Simmons, do you have any comment on the verdict?" Ernest paused, choosing his words carefully. "Justice isn't just about one case," he said. "It's about the decisions we make every day, the biases we challenge, and the truths we're willing to face. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of a conversation we all need to have." As he walked away, Ernest felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The fight for justice was far from over. But today, they had taken a step forward. And in a world where progress often felt like a distant dream, that step was everything.